this. Yes. Yes. Do we start the call over? Testing. Testing. Can you go out there? Yes. I'm gonna end the call. I started over. I did. I had to. She's still on. To attendees on the phone line, please mute your phone line. Thank you.
Come on, Ken. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Before we start, a couple housekeeping things. I understand we've got some folks on the phone. We don't have mute capabilities here, so if you would please mute your phone line if you haven't done that already. We will have some time for questions afterwards. The number is on the media advisory. If you have any questions, please text Suzanne Gage in our office. Brief introductions. My name is Mike Hilgers. I'm Nebraska's Attorney General. I'm joined by Governor Jim Pillen of the state of Nebraska, Brent Falgione of Greater Omaha Express Trucking Company, Dan Lathrop of A&A Temperature Controlled Shipping in Omaha, as well as Ken Grisham, the President and CEO of the Nebraska Trucking Association. We're announcing here today two lawsuits that we're filing on both coasts to help protect Nebraska consumers, the Nebraska trucking companies, the U.S. constitutions, as well as consumers around the state or around the country. Let me tell you exactly what we're doing and sort of give you a little bit of context for what's going on today. Everyone in Nebraska, everyone around the country should understand how important trucking is to our economy. The trucking, well over 80% of goods across the United States are handled through trucking. Trucking impacts are the cost of, through our trucking transportation supply chains, we're able to move protein, we move produce, we move shipping goods, things like on Amazon, FedEx. Everything is impacted in one form or another from our trucking industry. We also should know from the pandemic how critical that our trucking industry and our supply chain is to Nebraskans. Unfortunately, that is under threat, and let me tell you why. Almost every single truck in the United States, not all, but almost all, especially the heavy-duty ones, are run off fossil fuels. They're run off diesel engines. There's millions of those trucks, maybe well in excess of 16 million trucks around the country, all running on fossil fuels. Our entire infrastructure is set up for diesel, fossil fuel engine trucks around the country. There are very few, and hardly any in the large category, Class 8 category, heavy-duty trucks, of electric vehicles for trucking. And there's almost no infrastructure for electric vehicles generally, or trucking around the country. In fact, in Nebraska, there's not one trucking charging station in the entire state of Nebraska, anywhere that you can find. Trying to take that industry, which built up over decades with a diesel or fossil fuel based infrastructure, and transforming it to an electric based infrastructure is probably not feasible. It's probably not doable. There's no actual mass production facilities in the country to develop Class A heavy trucks. It's probably not doable from our electrical grid perspective. All around the country, we are at capacity or near capacity for most electrical grids. You're seeing brownouts in the state of California and other places around the country. We know as more electric vehicles come online, we know as AI comes online, that we are overstretched on capacity. We don't have the electrical capacity to be able to handle more electric vehicles or at scale. Certainly our trucking industry, we're not sure we can mass produce the millions of electric vehicles trucks that it would require, and the batteries that would be required to be able to power those trucks. We're not sure we have the minerals, the rare earth minerals like lithium or nickel or cobalt in order to create those batteries. There are lots of unknowns, but no rational Congress, and no Congress before us and no rational Congress today, in my opinion, would pass a nationwide electric vehicle mandate for trucking companies. And the good news is that hasn't happened, and we don't think that there's any rational world in which it would happen. Unfortunately, Nebraskans and frankly others around the country are under assault from both coasts. Both in California and in Washington, D.C., people who are unelected and unaccountable to Nebraskans are making decisions to drive us towards a national electric vehicle trucking mandate with extraordinarily disastrous consequences. Let me start with the West Coast. In California, there's a board called the California Air Resources Board, CARB. No one in Nebraska elected CARB. No, we don't vote for CARB. We don't have anything to do with CARB. But CARB wants to have something to do with us. And what CARB has said is you cannot operate in the state of California unless at a certain point in time you actually have an electric fleet. So you have trucking companies, one of the most important industries in the state of Nebraska. 1 out of 12 jobs in Nebraska are tied in some form or another to trucking. You have trucking companies in Nebraska. You have trucks that flow through Nebraska off I-80 that won't be able, if this regulation stands, will not be able to actually do business in the state of California. That is, in effect, a nationwide mandate. When you have 30% of our goods that come into this country come in through ports in California, they are saying you can't do business in California unless you agree to our very radical electric vehicle mandate for trucking companies. That's on the West Coast. On the East Coast, equally unaccountable, EPA, Biden administration EPA, issued, on Good Friday I might add, on a very slow news day, issued what is their heavy-duty vehicle rule, which would require, again, via national manufacturing mandates, a certain percentage of electric vehicles around the country within a very, very tight time frame for these types of products. Alone and in combination, these two rules, which no one voted for, certainly no one in Nebraska voted for, would put us on a collision course for a nationwide mandate for electric vehicles. That would have even if it was possible to be able to actually meet those mandates and create enough at scale, produce those level of trucks, and get the batteries and get the charging infrastructure and do all those things, the level of cost that it would entail, because these things don't have nearly the same kind of range, they can't take the same payload capacity, would flow, and we know that those costs would flow through to customers, would have a devastating impact on Nebraska businesses and Nebraska customers. Today, we are filing those two lawsuits that I mentioned because neither of those two rules that I mentioned are constitutional. The good news is the Constitution doesn't give California Air Resources Board the authority to dictate national terms to Nebraska, nor has Congress given the EPA the authority to dictate a nationwide mandate to Nebraskans or anyone else in the country for that matter, mandating these types of technology in these types of truck fleets. We filed a suit in California with 17 other states, along with the Nebraska Trucking Association. We're grateful for their leadership. We filed that in the Eastern District of California today, and we also filed in the DC Circuit Court of Appeals a challenge to the EPA's rulemaking authority. That also just was filed just a short time ago. We had 17 states, as I mentioned, in California, and in DC we had 24 states join us. Nebraska truckers were involved in the California lawsuits. So with that, I do want to say maybe a couple brief thank yous. I want to thank my team. We have incredible talent in our Solicitor General's office. They did a great work working on this particular complaint. It's very complicated, very complex, although very simple issues at the end of the day. These entities cannot mandate nationwide regulations for Nebraskans. I want to thank them. I want to thank all of our sister states, and I want to thank the governor and his team. They've been outstanding partners throughout this entire process. Everything that we've needed from them to be able to fight these suits against, whether it's California or the Biden administration, they've given us, and I'm very grateful for his leadership. And I also want to thank the Nebraska Trucking Association, because they know that this is an existential threat to them. And we are very grateful for the work that they've done helping us in this process. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand it over to the governor for some remarks. Governor.
Thanks, Mike. Well, thank you, Attorney General Hilgers, for your work and your team's work, and the truckers being here. But this conversation's way broader than the truckers. It starts with the truckers. Just so everybody gets the common sense. Nebraska, we're the center of the country. We're the center of the country, have extraordinary trucking companies that are being mandated by the federal government and by the state of California to do business in a whole different way. And for the record, we do understand a little something about electricity in the state of Nebraska. Nobody wants to ever talk about it, but Nebraska farmers and ranchers were the first to go away from fossil fuels. When our infrastructure was built for irrigation, we went from diesel engines to electricity 35 and 40 years ago. And we have it almost everywhere, but guess what? We have to shut our wells down 4 days out of 7 days because we don't have enough electricity to irrigate our crops as we need to in the state of Nebraska. But we, Nebraska farmers and ranchers, were the first to go to electricity, number one. Number two, I think that what's really, really important, and Attorney General Hilgers touched on it, but as your governor, we are going to work tirelessly to defend Nebraska agriculture and manufacturers. We ship things to the coast on the East Coast and the West Coast so our Nebraska businesses thrive. We can compete with anybody in the world. Just down outside of town, we have the best, an hour and a half from Lincoln, the best brick maker in the world. They ship bricks all over the world. They get there by rail, by trucks. Meat. We feed the world, save the planet, Nebraska agriculture. We feed the most cattle. The product has to get to the ports. Sorry, Governor Newsom. Come on, man. Get in the game and figure out what's going on here. We feed the world, we save the planet. The ports up and down California, you're going to tell us we can't get our product to the ports? It's beyond comprehension. I'm incredibly grateful to Attorney General Hilgers and his team to fight these unconstitutional movements. And this is just apropos for the course, right? Everybody aware what the state of California has done in Prop 12. I could debate anybody on the planet about how to correctly raise livestock. The better we care for our livestock, the better they help us feed, clothe, and educate our children, for crying out loud. And they, under Gavin Newsom's leadership, think that they know how to tell farmers and lock the market out of the U.S. market in California. The only bacon that can be eaten in California and sold there is if it's raised. Well, we got news. We got news for them. We can play that game too, right? The fake meat and the Petri dish meat folks, they're not going to have a place in Nebraska. Just mark that down on your calendar. It's time for us to roll up our sleeves and fight and defend Nebraska, and that's what we're doing, and I couldn't be more pleased to be standing here with everybody to make it happen. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Governor. Next, we'll hear from Brent Falgione of Greater Omaha Express. Go ahead, Brent.
Go ahead. Today I come before you to address a pressing concern that affects not only the state of Nebraska, but the entire Midwest region. As a small trucking company associated with the agricultural industry here in Nebraska, we have firsthand experience of the negative impacts stemming from California Air Resource Board's decision to prohibit diesel emission trucks as early as 2035 for some trucks, as well as the Biden-Harris administration's greenhouse gas emission standards for heavy-duty trucks on the Phase 3. First and foremost, let us acknowledge the pivotal role that diesel trucks play in facilitating the movement of goods across our vast nation. Nebraska is situated here in the crossroads of all major transportation routes and relies heavily on diesel trucks to transport agricultural products, manufactured goods, and other commodities to domestic and international markets. While this decision may seem distant geographically, and the Midwest cannot be overstated, the transportation of agriculture and Nebraska manufactured goods play a vital role in the global economy. In agriculture, diesel trucks are indispensable for transporting crops, livestock, and agricultural inputs to and from farms and processing facilities. The ability to access increasingly globalized markets have made Nebraska excel. For example, a ban on diesel trucks could result in a significant increase in transportation costs, which would directly impact the farmer and the rancher's ability to make a living by bringing their products to market efficiently, leading to delays and possible causing spoilage of perishable goods. Ultimately, such measures could jeopardize the livelihoods of farmers and the economic vitality of the rural communities that rely heavily on agriculture. Similarly, the manufacturing sector in Nebraska and the Midwest relies heavily on diesel trucks for the transportation of raw materials and components to be able to produce finished goods. These trucks provide flexibility and reliability necessary to meet the demands for just-in-time production. A ban on diesel trucks would disrupt manufacturing operations here in Nebraska and throughout the Midwest with increased production costs and erode the competitiveness, again, of our region's ability to manufacture goods for the global marketplace. Furthermore, the transition away from diesel trucks poses a significant challenge for industries that depend on heavy vehicles for their operation. While the alternative fuels technology, such as electric, hydrogen fuels, they show promise. They are not yet widely available or economically viable. The lack of infrastructure and support for alternative fuels further complicates the transition, leaving businesses in the United States at a competitive disadvantage compared to countries with more realistic policies. In conclusion, while the adverse effects of CARB's decisions to ban diesel trucks in less than 20 years extend far beyond California's borders, they impact the transportation, agriculture, and manufacturing industries here in Nebraska, as well as all states. And all other states need to stand up to California and not allow California to mandate unrealistic or unfeasible mandates. It is essential that the EPA reconsider Phase 3 standards until such time technology and infrastructure can support these changes. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon. Okay, with that, we'll take any questions if there are any. Martha.
So, are you saying that there will never be a time when the trucking sector can move to alternative fuels, to electric vehicles? That's an impossible task, or it just needs more time?
So the question is, for those on the line, is are we saying that it's impossible for the trucking industry to move towards electric vehicles, or they just need more time? I want to have Kent come in here in a second because he represents the association. Let's be very clear. If the free market were to work, maybe there would be some, or if the free market would be allowed to work, Martha, there probably would be some electric vehicles. I know a lot of the emissions technology has really improved on these types of vehicles as is, even with fossil fuels. But what's very clear about this, what is impossible is trying to comply with this kind of a mandate that has uncertain, very costly technology. It's not clear we will ever be able to build out the truck infrastructure that we would need. Very unclear we'd ever be able to build out the electrical infrastructure that we need. Just one truck charging station has enough power for a small community. We're talking about 16 million, we're over 16 million trucks going around the country, or that exist in the country at least right now. What is impossible is what they're trying to do. What might be possible, what has been possible for this country for decades, if not well over a century, is the power of the free market and the power of innovation when unfettered by governmental mandates. So that is what we're saying in this lawsuit. But Kent, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
Thank you, sir. I would echo what the Attorney General just said, that we believe in the trucking industry that the free market truly is the solution to the question. We have never in the trucking industry said no to battery electric vehicles. They have a place in our industry today. We believe that that role will grow in the future. What we're saying no to, quite frankly, is the mandates that have been developed on dishonest science and irresponsible politics. Because when you look at a diesel truck that's rolling off of the assembly line today, it is 98% near zero emissions. So if we replaced the aging fleet out there, because in most states more than 50% of the truck fleet is still pre-2010 model years, if we were active and aggressive at replacing those fleets, we would be running trucks that are at 98% zero emissions today on existing diesel technology. We have data that shows if you believe, first of all, that there is no such thing as a zero emissions vehicle. It doesn't exist. Because you have to, if you're honest and responsible in this argument, you have to consider the lifespan of the truck. If you take in the emissions that are created from mining and production and continue that all the way through till the salvage end of that truck, it is not a zero emission vehicle just because it runs on batteries. So what we're asking for is an opportunity to develop the industry further. And if you take a diesel-powered engine today and you replace it with a battery electric, you've only actually reduced carbon emissions by 30%. If, however, you run that same truck on current technology and current infrastructure with the power of agriculture brought into it as well, and you run that truck on a biodiesel or a renewable diesel product, you actually reduce emissions by 70%. So if the argument really is about carbon reduction, we can do that today. If the argument is about something to do with an electrified technology, philosophy, or religion, well, that's a lot farther away than what we are, honest people are willing to admit.
Thanks, Ken. Governor, do you have something?
Yeah. Martha, I think the other piece that's really straightforward in regard to your question is we have the perfect model. We have the perfect model that took place in the state of Nebraska with switching diesel engines out for electricity and irrigation in Nebraska. Why did that happen? Because it was good for business. It took place because it was good for business and the free market. And that's how this process has to work. Government mandates never work. They never have. They never will. Free market, free enterprise. And oh, by the way, for the state of Nebraska, if you want to think about manufacturing, and if we really care about people around the world, you know, we have 4 companies that make every single pivot that goes everywhere around the world to help people eat. And those, how do you think those pivots get around the world? They've got to go both coasts. They got to go to California, and they get there by diesel trucks. And obviously there's lots of production going on in the state of Nebraska for biodiesel. We have two gigantic plants under construction now to be able to be utilizing biodiesel. So those are a couple $2 billion invested. So are we saying we're never going to utilize that investment in Nebraska? No, it's absolutely crazy.
Thanks, Governor. Any other questions? Andrew?
Is Nebraska taking the lead in
So the question is Nebraska taking the lead in both of these suits? Well, we are a coalition, but this is one that in both suits we did organize. Nebraska did organize. No, hold on. Oh, Zach had his hand up here, Fred. Go ahead, Zach.
So, Attorney General Hilgers, Governor Pillen, either of you been in contact with EPA, Biden officials, or California officials prior to filing the lawsuit?
So the question is whether or not either Governor Pillen or myself have been in contact with the EPA or or California officials prior to the lawsuit. Well, regarding the EPA, no, they have the rule. There's a process. So they issued a rule on Good Friday, as I mentioned, very slow news day going into the Easter weekend. The next step in that process is not to call the EPA. They're not allowed to sort of negotiate changes in rule. And once the rule is published, the next step, if there is a step, is to file a lawsuit. And that step, by the way, is in the D.C. Circuit. California, I did give Attorney General Bonta a heads up before we filed the lawsuit, but that's the extent of those kinds of conversations. Governor Pillen, do you?
Yeah, I guess what I can tell you is I'm certainly spending energy developing relationships and making people aware of Nebraska. I've spent time with Secretary of EPA Michael Reagan and tried to help him understand how important ethanol, how important diesel and biofuels are for the state of Nebraska. I think it's important that people understand the total lay of the land in the state of Nebraska.
Fred?
Aside from your policy objections, what are your legal arguments?
That's a great question. So let's take both, because they're slightly different for either, although in both cases, neither are constitutional, Fred. So let's take California first. So California, the Constitution does give the U.S. Congress under Article 1, Article 1, Section 8, the ability to regulate interstate commerce. One of the things, and this is textbook law, Fred, the state of Nebraska could not say tomorrow that it wants to change the size of railroad gauges that run through the state, because they're an interstate instrumentality. We have railroads all over the place. And so if we change the gauge, it makes sense. You don't want to have Nebraska to have, different size, different types of mud flap on a truck, or a different, which by the way, we couldn't do, or a different size railroad gauge. And so what you can't do, Nebraska couldn't tomorrow say, you know what, we have the largest stretch of I-80 in the country. You can't come through Nebraska unless you run your trucks off ethanol. We would not have the power to do this. One of the things that is, when we entered into the U.S. Constitution, the states gave up. California similarly can't say, you can't access our courts, you can't access our ports, you can't access our markets unless you follow these types of interstate modes of transportation in the shipping context. So there's a dormant commerce clause. The other thing that's a little bit more directly on point, Fred, is that there is a statute in place, and it says no state can actually regulate tailpipe emissions. California does have the opportunity to ask for a waiver. It does not have a waiver. It hasn't asked for a waiver. It doesn't have a waiver. It's asked for one. It doesn't have one. So we think on both federal statutory grounds as well as the constitutional grounds, there's not the legal authority for California to act. I could go to the EPA. EPA is a simple statute. The EPA does not have the statutory authority to do what it's trying to do. It's a major questions case. The Supreme Court's been very clear about this. Congress doesn't hide elephants in mouse holes. They don't try to reorder the American economy. And by the way, it is hard to overstate the radical reorganization of the American economy that these rules try to do. You can't do that without congressional authorization. There is nowhere in the statutes anywhere that gives the EPA the ability. They do have the ability to do some things on tailpipe emissions. There is a world of difference, on the one hand, from saying, you have to have your tailpipe emissions, which imply a diesel-powered, fossil fuel-powered engine, and say, actually, what we're going to do is force companies to manufacture a whole different type of technologies. So we think on the law, it's very clear. We have any questions remotely, Suzanne? Okay. Oh, Andrew? We'll go. First, Andrew.
For Tim, I think you mentioned that most of the trucks in general fleets are maybe pre-2010, but you were also talking about modern trucks are I guess, a lot better for emissions. Because what is the average age of a truck on a road in Nebraska? And I guess what are the efforts to switch to, I guess, trucks with fewer emissions?
So the question is, what's the average age of a truck in Nebraska, and then what are the efforts to improve emissions? Is that what you're saying? Andrew, go ahead, Ken.
You're going to ask me to recall, I'm kind of the old guy in this group, so my recall on specific data might be lacking on some things, but I'm happy to follow up with you on specifics. However, I can tell you that in Nebraska, 53% of our trucking fleet is newer than 2010, which puts Nebraska in a better position than most states because we have exceeded half the fleet has been converted to newest technology, next generation technology. I can tell you that in California, actually it's the opposite, where up to 80% of their trucks are still running in the pre-2010 category. And it's not hard to figure out why, because the cost of doing business in California is so prohibitive that the fleets out there are not able to cycle equipment in the same efficient manner that we do here in Nebraska. And what that boils down to is if you use that 2010 as the line for current generation or pre-generational trucks, one truck that's running in the pre-2010 generates the emissions of 30 trucks today. So for every year it's on the road, it is generating the same emissions as 30 new trucks. It's a staggering difference in the technology. Does that help?
Do you know how much the trucking industry has reduced the amount of carbon emissions on?
Yeah, the question for those online is how much the trucking industry has reduced, and I'm not sure if you're referring to like tonnage of carbon or how. And I have to tell you, I don't know that statistic off the top of my head, but Andrew, I'd be really happy to get it for you.
Any other questions?
Did I understand you correctly to say that there's not enough electricity to operate irrigation systems 4 out of 10 days currently?
Yeah, so the question was, by Fred, question was, do I understand that there's not enough electricity in Nebraska for when we're in the growing season? Yeah, that's exactly right. We have to get go in shutdown mode. So when we're out of 7 days, we'll be shut down 3 out of 7 days because there's not enough electricity. So we all have to work together, figure out when you can pump, you got to get after it, get your water on in the time. So yeah, nobody can pump free rain when they want to.
Zach?
Can you specify when these rules from EPA in California, can you specify when they take effect for each one?
Well, the EPA, so the EPA, they have ACF I'll start with. So ACF is currently law. They have multiple different requirements. One requirement is like a reporting requirement. That's in effect right now. They have some staggered implementation schedules. And sometimes you hear these years, you might say, well, 2027, boy, Mike, that's 2.5 years from now. Or 2032, for a lot of these major manufacturers, Zach, it will be they might have a regulatory time horizon where they make decisions 7 years out from their model year. So really, 2024, they're making decisions right now for the early 2030s. So it staggers up in time. The first EV sort of, requirement one in California starts next year, where you have to have, for a certain category and class, certain size, you have to have at least one. It goes up significantly from there, and the first similar requirement under the EPA rule is in 2027. It's a good question. One thing, let's see if there are any other questions, but one thing we didn't touch on, just to give you a sense of, we've talked about some of the really sort of existential, fundamental ways that this doesn't comport to reality. But if you think about just the cost of diesel versus EV, I just want to give you put a couple things in context. Number one, EVs right now are 2 to 3 times the cost of a diesel. So if you are a small trucking company and you want to replace your fleet, it's probably going to be impossible. You're probably just going to go out of business. So that's number one. That's assuming there's no sense that cost is going to go down even in mass producing, because we have a limitation on the minerals, the rare minerals that go into production of these particular products. Secondly, because the batteries are heavier, they actually have less capacity. So you have to have more than one truck in order to handle the same kind of capacity that you were shipping in the first place. At the same time, the range is dramatically different. So if you're talking about if you're talking about today, a typical, Class 8 heavy-duty truck might have, if you fill it up, 200 gallons, tanks, you might be able to get 1,300 miles before you have to fill up again. Right now, on the EV side, generously, maybe 250 or 300 miles before you have to recharge. Again, there's no charging infrastructure anywhere in the state of Nebraska. So if you want to replicate just what you're trying to do today with EVs, you got the 2, 3, maybe 4x the size of your fleet. Very few companies, especially small companies, are going to have the resources to do that. And in this limited, where we have a limited labor supply, and where everyone is struggling with workforce, how in the world does anyone with some common sense think that it will be remotely possible for us to ramp up our trucking, not just the infrastructure, but our personnel to be able to handle that? All those costs flow down to customers. They all flow down to customers. At least one recent study suggested that that the impact on inflation from all these different costs that I've described is at least nationwide, at least over 1%. I think, frankly, that's probably understating it, just given how fundamental and ingrained our current trucking industry is with our supply chains around the country. Just look at what happened with COVID and the pandemic, how restricting that supply can increase costs. I think there's never a good time for doing what we're trying to do, but especially in this moment, in this inflationary environment, with so many supply constraints, I think it's a terrible idea. Yes?
If companies would have to comply with these rules, what would the cost be to the Nebraska consumer and to the Nebraska economy?
So the question is if Nebraska companies were to comply, what would the cost be to the Nebraska economy and Nebraska consumer? Well, I'll let either Brent or maybe Brent can jump in here and tell. I mean, there will be companies that will no doubt go out of business. No doubt. I just referenced some consumer inflation. I mean, there's no doubt that the cost of goods will go up. The cost of electricity will have to go up. I mean, given the extreme demand. And we haven't talked about if we're trying to put more data centers and more AI online, electrical costs are going to go up. So there's no doubt there will be costs in at least those two ways. But Brent, do you have anything that you?
Well, I'm going to use this for an example. So you've got the city of Valentine, Nebraska, and you've got a shipment that goes from Omaha to the grocery store in Valentine, Nebraska. Currently on a diesel technology truck, that driver will be able to leave Omaha, deliver the goods in Valentine, and make it back in one day. With an electric vehicle, you've got 2 to 3 times the cost for the vehicle. The range of the vehicle, that driver will not be able to even leave Omaha and make it to Valentine in one drive shift. And they're going to have to set, and they're going to have to take a 10-hour break while that vehicle charges. Then they're going to make it to Valentine, make the delivery, and then on his way back, he's going to have to stop again and charge before he can make it back to the distribution center in Omaha to reload. So now you've added 3 days transportation on a truck. That person has to get paid 3 days worth of labor because it's taken 3 days instead of 1. And your Valentine's only getting 20,000 pounds worth of product instead of 40,000 pounds worth of product because of the additional weight of the truck and the equipment. So when you add all that up, I'm not a futurist, but that just made that $4 hamburger become $10 because you just went 3 times on everything you're talking about. If you're going 3 times the time, 3 times the wages, and 3 times the cost, but you're cutting half the freight, it's inevitably going to hinder each one of us at the grocery store where we're buying clothing, we're buying feed to feed our livestock. It's going to affect everything.
By the way, on that point, it's hard to think of an even more existential threat to rural communities in Nebraska. We don't have any, instead of 3 times, we have 0 in Nebraska. Where are they going to prioritize charging stations when they start putting them in place? Well, I-80 corridor, major highways. The towns that are going to not have one within, you can imagine all sorts of great communities here in Nebraska that will not have, they have to have a charging station within 200, 250 miles. I mean, what communities are going to get cut off from the flow of goods because of rules like this? And that, more than anything, is something that we're fighting for and standing up for. Yes, Andrew?
The gentleman mentioned Proposition 12. I guess, how confident are you that the Supreme Court will do differently on this? Or what's the difference between Prop 12 and what you guys are on today, because the Supreme Court upheld Prop 12?
Yeah, it's a good question. So just for everyone's awareness, Prop 12 is another effort. California's largest market, I think, in the United States. It's a top 10 economy. And what they're trying to do is to use their market power to dictate ideological terms to people who didn't vote for their office holders, who didn't actually appoint any of their unelected officials. What they did in Prop 12 was try to put some additional restrictions on what pork could be imported into. The governor, I'm sure, is an expert on this, could be imported into California. That was a little bit of a different issue because it didn't deal with, and I'm not saying that, I don't think that was rightly decided, but didn't deal with the same kinds of issues. There's a lot of case law in Nebraska. Well, two things. One, there wasn't a federal statute in play, which I referenced to Fred. California can't do what it's doing by statute. The states are prohibited from doing this. So that's distinction number one. Distinction number two, if the Dormant Commerce Clause or the Interstate Commerce Clause means anything that we know from the U.S. Supreme Court rulings, is that states can't do what California is trying to do by changing sort of and dictating the different types of means of transportation within their state. That goes to the core commerce function of the federal government, and we think under the Dormant Commerce Clause that's a lot different. Now, I disagreed with the Prop 12 decision. I think the court, I don't think they got to the right result, but I think for at least those two reasons that this is different.
Nebraska ethanol producers benefit from California's low carbon fuel requirements. How is this any different from that?
So the question is, Nebraska ethanol producers do benefit from their fuel requirements? Well, I haven't done. I mean, this says you cannot operate operate a trucking fleet in California unless you meet those particular requirements. So I think it's
it's a great question, Fred. How it differs is it's free market. California has decided that they want to pay for ethanol that has lower carbon footprint, and which we Nebraska producers do. So that's a free market item, pure and simple. Number two, Prop 12 still probably has a great probability of making a resurrection in the conversation. There were some tremendous mistakes made by legal counsel within the pork industry that I'm not an attorney, so I won't speak to that. And then maybe the third thing I think that's important in this conversation, just when we talk about infrastructure, just think about it. We've been moving diesel engines in irrigation for 35 years. We still have diesel engines because we can't get the infrastructure to every place where we want it. So it's a process that takes a long time. And then when you talk about the extra freight, and we're not going to be able to rebuild our roadways to make 100,000-pound trailers, it's just some cumbersomeness that nobody's ever talked about.
You have any questions online, Suzanne? Nothing? Any other questions? All right. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining. Thank you.